All right, so first and foremost, do each of you want to tell the crowd who you are and I guess what it is you do in blockchain?
Sure. Hi, I'm Wassim. I'm an independent researcher in this space. I work on a variety of different projects, mainly to do with analytics, but also I've got a kind of a side project, which is an open-ended initiative to widen access and usage of cryptocurrencies and blockchain technology with a particular focus on censorship resistance for people under economic and political oppression.
Well, my name's Alison, Alexis. I'm still actually trying to figure out what I do in this space, but what I would say is community member. I like to say I'm a blockchain community maximalist. I work with Bob, Crypto Chicks, which is an MPO out of Toronto, and we have our own consulting business. We're working with Quant Fury, which is a retail trading app.
Hi, I'm Virgil. I work for special projects for the Ethereum Foundation.
Hi, I'm Kong Gao. I'm CSO of Godot Lab, created by Roy Joy. It's a blockchain research development lab, including we focus on like decentralized application, IoT, blockchain solutions. Also like consensus algorithm, and we're also a sponsor of the ETC community in China.
All right, great. Thank you all very much.
Thanks for having us.
You're doing me the honor of joining me here. So the first question I have, and I said in 3 to 5 words, but if you need more words, that's perfectly fine. What does immutability mean to you?
Okay, I guess I'll start. The TLDR for me is resistance to change. I'd say that immutability is probably the extreme of that. So let's say immutability is 100% resistance to change.
Yeah, for me, mutability was never really a word I'd heard much before blockchain space. When I looked it up, there was something to talk. The first thing that came up was immutability of God, so I found that kind of very telling. So it kind of makes me think of something a bit dogmatic, but yeah, also kind of similar to what you're saying. And I would kind of interpret it more as a resistance to change, but not resistant to change, hopefully.
So I thought I used to know what this word meant, but I'm not sure I know anymore. At least I'll say internally, the way we use the term is that we meant, we use it as hard forks that were not related to any kind of technical upgrade. We usually call them aesthetic hard forks.
Okay. Well, I should say that my background is psychology, so the way how I see immutability is, like a lot of things, I see it as a standard, as a way to measure something. So the way how I see immutability is it's a vulnerability measure for centralization at a protocol level.
Yeah, great.
Those are all really different. That's actually really concerning.
It's funny how everybody has very different explanations, and I all kind of agree with them. So I'm not sure which one it actually is. It's kind of all of those together.
I think part of the problem is that we're trying to use kind of old words and old terms in this new technological paradigm.
Yeah, for new concepts.
And everyone has their own interpretations based on their culture or language or their understanding and experience. And I think that sometimes causes a lot of conflict.
I wonder sometimes if there's another dimension to this that Westerners or people from the kind of Anglophone world may not pick up on, because there's hundreds of languages in the world, and the different things have different meanings from the different cultural contexts.
Yeah, absolutely, without a doubt. So I guess moving on then, kind of in the same vein as immutability, what does censorship resistance mean to you?
Okay, again, let's talk about this at the sort of extreme end. I would say that censorship resistance is the impossibility of third-party interference in a process.
To me, that one is like more self-explanatory. I think less room for sort of interpretation. I think it just kind of is what it says, resistant to censorship.
I guess I'd be a little more specific. So I'd say if you have 2 transactions, I guess you don't know the to and from addresses for each transaction. So it'd be hard to have, so if you want to make a blacklist of, say, accounts you don't like, you don't know what the accounts are involved in a transaction, I guess, before it's committed.
Okay. I mean, my definition for like censorship resistance is sort of like consistent with immutability. It's just that immutability is at the protocol level and censorship is at the social level.
Interesting. Okay, so it sounds like it's easier to kind of come to some sort of agreement on what censorship resistance is than immutability itself. Does that sound right to everybody?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Especially in this context.
Yeah, I'm thinking censorship resistance is just a lot more concrete, and immutability is maybe one approach at censorship resistance. So my next question then is, when is it okay to like change a rule in a blockchain? And I have a few options. Obviously, if you're in between, then say so. Are you allowed to change anything that happened in the past? Only new things that will happen in the future, both, or neither?
Yeah, this is not an easy question to approach. I guess it depends on a like idiosyncratic basis from network to network, depending on the kind of social and technological contract that network enshrines. In terms of like forwards and backwards, I suppose it's a little bit less contentious to change the rules of things going forwards than to retrospectively change things.
Yeah, I kind of agree with that. It seems, I mean, I'm definitely not as technical as some of the people here, but it seems like if you're going and retroactively changing things in the past, that kind of defeats some of the purpose. But then at the same point, to sort of say everything forevermore must be adhering to specific rules that at a certain point in time, maybe that also doesn't make sense. In 2300, does it make sense that they must adhere to rules that somebody in this era came up with? Maybe no.
I'm not sure any strong opinions. It's, I mean, I guess it's, I mean, whatever, I mean, I guess there's just community expectation. Yeah, so something like, so I think as long as you're sort of clear, like you're sort of socially clear what's like permissible, then, you know, I guess just don't go too far outside that radius.
Yeah, I mean, like, I agree with most of them. I feel like, you know, we shouldn't change, like, anything that's happened in the past, because that's the whole point of, like, you know, POW and blockchain. The idea is that whatever happened in the past, the longer it's happened, like, you can't change it. And about, like, you know, making changes at the protocol level that will, like, influence, like, you know, future protocol development. Like, again, you know, saying that my background is psychology, the way how we see it is that, like, you know, there needs to be, like, a dependent variable. And this dependent variable for, like, measuring whether an upgrade is worthwhile is, like, you know, to make, like, a cost and benefit analysis to see, like, whether the upgrade is worth, like, you know, whatever sacrifice you might have to do with, like, you know, security.
Yeah, and that's interesting too, because sometimes it's very hard to figure out what the trade-offs are until you've actually like made them. So, yeah, these are not easy questions, by the way. I just wanted to be clear.
Yeah.
And also, I suppose in the permissionless setting, if we're talking about these kind of decentralized networks and a subset of the constituents don't agree with those changes, then they can fork off. They can leave and do their own thing, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So then can communities vote to censor transactions? And if so, kind of what's the acceptable threshold for that?
Tough question. I think it depends on that sort of social and technological contract that's usually enshrined at the beginning of a network. I suppose you could engineer a threshold if that was something that network, the stakeholders in that network would agree to. But It's a tough one. I look at networks, especially ones that use DPoS. EOS is quite a good example of that. You've got the validator set of 21, and you require a quorum of 2/3 plus 1. So you have the possibility that 15 of those stakeholders can censor the other 6. So it's really hard to give an objective answer.
Yeah, I kind of agree with what you're saying. It's sorry, actually, can you repeat? I'm kind of lost my train of thought.
Yeah, sure. So can communities vote to censor
Yeah.
transactions? And if
Yeah.
so, what's the acceptable threshold in terms of it?
Yeah, I think it's like a good theoretical question because obviously there's some parts of like censorship resistant that who is judge or jury of what is allowable. However, at the same time, we still live in a world that has some laws, and in most countries in the world have at least some sort of basic laws. And my personal point of view is that if I wouldn't necessarily want to be involved with something that was used predominantly for money laundering or things like that was really sort of truly against the value system, but at the same time, it's like how do you kind of, like when you're saying about threshold, I don't know where is that threshold and at what point do you get into censoring too much, but there's also like, is there too little? And can people just do whatever they would like? Yeah, so I think it's a very tough question.
Thank you.
I suppose for proof of work, it'd be 51%. And I don't know. You can just, because if there's one you don't like, well, you just fork and you just keep going and you eventually win. Under a proof of stake, I guess you could do it with 2/3,
Okay.
or under typical proof of stake designs.
I like that, a very mathematical answer.
Yeah. Well, I mean, like earlier, he mentioned about threshold, but then, like, my brain is like, how do you even define that threshold, right? So my answer to this question is that, like, I don't think anyone, like, developer, like core developers should like make any changes. Like this change should like come from the community. I mean, like we have a lot of hacks, like Bitfinex hacks and everything, and these are sort of like censored because blockchain is like visible, like everyone can see that where the money is going. So like, and I feel like blockchain shouldn't like work like by itself. It should work with like government. So like government can like sort of like class action at like in the U.S. like there's community that got affected, like they work with the law enforcement to censor that transaction. So like that, yeah, it should come from like community censorship.
Okay, interesting. And yeah, you touched on a really interesting point there, Kong, that leads into my next question. The fact that transactions are visible, can a blockchain be censorship resistant when you have visible transactions?
I think so. I think so, because the act of observing an action doesn't necessarily result in the fact that you can alter it or you can affect it.
It's obviously harder. It's
Yeah.
obviously harder.
I had a lot of fun writing these.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, if you can see the transactions, I mean, then you can say, oh, I'm just going to just decline to put these in a block. Or if you can see the transactions in a certain block, you can say, oh, I'm just going to decline to build on top of you. So obviously, the more sealed transactions, the better.
I suppose that's a bit like that blacklisting via feather forking thing that Miller characterized in 2014.
I mean, that's a word. Is that not what we're talking about? Like, that's what we're talking about.
I guess I already answered that question with the answer to my previous question. It should come from like, seeing that, a transaction is, public information, like community should like just work together with like law enforcement.
Okay, great. So then obviously going deeper into, I guess, censorship and less about the technical of it, but more about the social layer. is control of systems that are built around blockchains important? So, for example, websites, forums, do these things contribute to censorship resistance? And what might be the best way? How do you approach it in order to resist censorship, if censorship resistance is the goal?
I guess we can come back to this idea of having properties on the protocol layer and then having the kind of social layer of the ecosystem that comes around it. I don't know.
Yeah, it's one of those things where you kind of, how do you weigh it? Like you don't, especially as we're trying to move more towards further adoption, a lot of misinformation out there is obviously detrimental, but there is, like I think a lot of people feel really interested in blockchain because there is ability, if you want to go and, do something and you put something out there that you don't, it's not, this type of like IP or the way in other companies that it would just be brought down. So I do like that ability for whomever to self-select and be able to go out and put information out there. But then at the same time, you have that other side of like misinformation and how that will sort of affect, the views of other people.
And everybody doesn't need to answer in order all the time if you don't want to. So I'm just throwing that out there.
I mean, I got nothing on this one. I mean, I don't know. Different societies seem to have different opinions on this issue.
Yeah, without a doubt.
I mean, like, for me, I feel like, it's not like either or situation. It's about, like, striking a right balance. So the answer to this question depends on the yes part, in terms of, like, censorship. I feel like, like she said, like, there's so many disinformation out there. Like, there are, like, with ETC community, there are a lot of people making, like, claims that are just, like, downright false. Like, ETC is, like, controlled by, like, ETC Delting, and there's other, like, misinformation out there. So I feel like, these sort of, like, message should be censored, but then, like, we should give them, like, whenever we see, like, people post something like that, we should just, like, tell them that it's just not right, give them like contrary evidence. But if they were like to still keep on doing that, then like we can censor it and then like make the reason why they are censored like public, I feel like. And the no part of the answer to this question is that like it shouldn't be censored because I feel like, like blockchains are very difficult, like, technology, and like we should like really break like EC, IP, like all these like proposals. Like we should there should be a way for them to like to break these like technological terms down to like that like lay people can understand. So on the way there's going to be like different interpretations and stuff like that, and people should be encouraged to open the discussion group to talk about different aspects of it. And like the way how I see it will be sort of like a bottom-up thing. Like at the bottom, you will have like community, different like discussion group dedicated to like different interpretation or different opinions, and then like whatever idea is won in that group will then like be moved out. It's very ideal.
It's a hard thing.
It's hard. In like an ideological world.
I would like to see more information from obviously there's not like just one group of power, but there's obviously people that are more close to something, and to have more information from people who actually have more facts would tend to be better. And it's sometimes you don't see that, but you see so much misinformation, and there is going to be always a story and a narrative that's told, and when there isn't information that people can sort of see as even somewhat objective, people will just make assumptions. And I do find that the blockchain community tends to be a little bit of a suspicious community. So there tends to be assumptions that may not really have much validity.
A related point is that social media and websites are vulnerable to kind of Sybil attacks with sock puppets. So what we really need is some kind of robust self-sovereign or decentralized identity, which might not reveal people's identities when they choose to remain anonymous or pseudonymous, but would also mitigate against this kind of brigading and this kind of thing you might see on social media.
Well, I liked when, I remember when, I guess, the ETC Cooperative, or you put out a report about kind of what was going on. I don't remember if it talked about spending, but it talked about quite a lot of things that were going on in the community. And I thought, oh, that was really great, because obviously involved, and you're kind of able to put information out, and so there's less guessing games that people will do. And I would actually like to see more of that with other projects.
Yeah. And like, I feel like, sort of like consistent with what you're saying. I feel like, there's a value to like, information that's like being communicated. So like, we should like focus on like, encouraging people to talk about like things that is like on topic, basically sort of like to increase the value of the information communicated between like members.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that really gets to the fact that this all just takes time. It takes a lot of conversation, a lot of education of people. These aren't easy concepts. They're not easy questions. And they're not even terms that are easy to understand. My own personal definition of all these things has evolved significantly over the last 3 or 4 years that I've been involved in blockchain. So it's really interesting to just, see this all play out. And I got to say, you guys have some really good ideas.
There actually is something that recently occurred to me that might be helpful. So I work on the Ethereum name service, and we have this, and for any domain, actually for any domain in the world, you actually are required to have copyright. So if you register, like say, Microsoft dot lol, then if Microsoft asks for it, you have to give it to them. And that's just, there's these rules, there's this process you follow, and it's called the UDRP if you're curious. But so on the Ethereum name service, they want to know, are you going to use this same procedure? And if you don't, you get locked out of the big internet. And so what's sort of our policy on that? And our policy was to come up with different zones. So we're going to have the zone that was, .nice, where we do follow, sort of all these typical rules, and we have say .anarchy, and if you get a URL, and .anarchy is like really just first come first serve, have at it, and if people start, and if you get a URL to Citibank.anarchy, maybe you shouldn't put in your banking information into that. And so that was kind of what we came up with. We sort of had with different zones that were very clearly demarcated. And maybe if you go to a .anarchy for the first time, maybe you'd have like a little pop-up that says, just letting you know, you're going into the Wild West now. You should probably not, this is kind of a crazy place. Yeah. But if you want to click through, so be it.
That's a very interesting approach. I like that.
Reminds me a little bit of the newsgroups era of the internet, where we had the kind of alt subcategory.
It was inspired by that, yeah. So there was the alt dot, where you could just go crazy, and there were others that were curated. And so we don't actually know what someone saying ICANN would say to that. They've never allowed a .anarchy, but that's at least the kind of approach that we're currently looking at.
All right, so back to immutability, because it's such a fun thing to talk about. It's often seen as an all or none thing. Is this true? Is immutability, does it have to be 100%? Can it be 90%? And does occasional mutability or censorship, affect the whole, or does it only affect the specific part that's being censored?
We might need some new words, because the word immutability sort of lends itself to being this kind of all or nothing thing. I remember having an interesting conversation on Twitter with somebody, and they brought up the example of the Quran, the Muslim holy book, as being possibly the longest lasting immutable text. And he hypothesized that this was partly as a function of the decentralization of it. So we were trying to think of other examples of long-lasting, immutable records. The only one I could really think of was the Doomsday Book, which was the Middle Ages kind of tax collection system we had in Norman England. But there was only one copy of that for several hundred years. So, the guy in the church that's looking after that, he might have a special pen,
I don't know. I personally don't like all or nothing things. Had lots of tweeting with Donald, and he doesn't always like my approach to things, but I generally don't like things that are very dogmatic and this or this, because I don't think that we don't have much certainty of anything in the world. So to say something must always follow something I don't think it doesn't follow like a scientific sort of methodology or rigor. It's kind of just, you must do something. But at the same time, obviously, you know, we can't just have like at any whim be changing sort of records and things like that. So I would hope that it is not a total all or nothing, but obviously more towards one way than sort of a central.
Got nothing.
I guess I already answered that question. It's about like, you know, again, saying that my background is from psychology, so there needs to be like a, you know, variable that we measure like, you know, anything against. And this variable should be like, you know, sort of like a cost-benefit analysis, like, you know, that, you know, whatever the upgrade, like if the upgrade improves like, you know, usability, scalability, then like user-friendliness, then like, and then see like whether how much is sacrificed, like, you know, underlying security, because like blockchain without security is just nothing. So like we shouldn't compromise it. So we should make that cost-benefit analysis to see whether the, you know, upside is worth the downside, if there is a downside to security.
I think the concern is that people have different utility functions for these different properties. Okay. So even if you could agree objectively on like, you know, the cost and the benefit of each one, the other people value each property varies. Yeah. So I'm not, it's unclear to me how much that would help.
It is unclear. It is a difficult question. Yeah, I just feel like there still needs to be like a, you know, sort of like a standard, so that like to ground people's like, you know, thinking, you know.
Yeah.
I guess there's also the possibility that you might have a slippery slope kind of situation where once some changes are made, then it opens the door for making it easier to go through that process again.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think a lot of times it comes down to not sort of understanding if there is a process, or just being at like the whims of whatever. Yeah, and I think I come from, I'm a chartered accountant, started my career as financial auditor. So, you know, I do see that there has to be a place for some type of duty of care, or, you know, whether it's, if people don't believe in regulation, at least some type of self-regulation, and it just can't be, like flailing around and we have an issue and let's just deal with it. But there has to be some type of process, standards and things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I don't want to, we only have a couple of minutes left, so there's just a couple more questions I want to get to. Obviously, the big elephant in the room is that the DAO was related to this.
We're still talking about that? Yeah, no, it's like, I mean,
well, no,
I mean, we don't think about this.
Well, yeah.
Well, maybe they do.
It is what it is. You know, two great chains have come out of it. So my question, though, is when it comes to it, yeah, there was the DAO attacker, and that person obviously had their balance taken away. But there were many child DAOs that were very hard to identify who actually owned them. There was a total of about $6 to $7 million US worth at the time in them. And these were generally highly technical people who were secure from the DAO attacker. The DAO attacker could have never taken their funds. Just the question was whether or not who owned these addresses was the DAO attacker. So what happened during the hard fork is that those funds also went to a group of trustees that were essentially going to decide who gets their funds back, who is the DAO attacker, and who is not. What are your thoughts on this part of the process that maybe isn't so commonly known or talked about?
I mean, if anyone earned their money, it was the DAO attacker.
Why?
Well, they did all the work.
For me, I guess it comes back to this idea of the social contract. So one of the big selling points of Ethereum in the early days was the possibility of building unstoppable applications. And when the DAO was launched, and then when these events happened, I suppose there was a difficult choice to be made between whether you would preserve that particular part of the social technical contract, or you would take a philosophy of, let's say, harm minimization of the network. But there is this question mark over, if these child DAOs were being run by innocent bystanders, essentially, then you could make a case that this resembled collective punishment.
Going back to what he said earlier, while we're still talking about DAO, consistent with my definition of immutability, coming from a psychology background, that is, the way how we, psychologists, what we measure is action, what actually matters, because that's the most telling, that's the most informative information. So the way how, the DAO was handled is very telling of, what kind of mindset they represent. So, and about people who are technical to handle the child DAO, I feel they should be able to take full control of their transactions. And for those of us who are not technical enough to take care of their fund, I don't know. There should be an educational thing, to really tell people to how to do things. But then education is a big part of technology. It's about I feel there's a big gap between knowledge gap between developers and lay people, and we should focus more on bridging this gap through education.
There is maybe one thing I might be able to help since we're talking about the DAO. One thing I think is a common standard that has come up within the foundation is that if there is a bug and the amount of money at risk is comparable to the amount of money we estimate it would take to successfully attack the network, then we're much more likely to do an emergency hard fork to correct it, because we would say something like, we don't want there to be any funny incentives to attack the network. And so, I want to be clear, it's not policy, but this has often come up, and I think it's certainly in the ballpark of reasonability.
So that's almost like an economic threshold.
Yeah,
in a way.
Yeah, no, so you often, in the proof of stake, it makes it especially easy, because you can have two conflicting finalized blocks if 1/3 gets burned. So if when the total at stake. So if you said, oh well, say half, the amount for the bug is say half of all the money at stake, you're like, whoa, yeah, no, you totally want to get that one, because otherwise the miners are gonna want to do some funny business, and you can't have that.
Yeah, without a doubt. So we've run a little over time. The next speaker, are they coming up now? Okay, perfect. All right, I would very much like to thank the panel for giving very thoughtful responses to difficult questions. And yes.